it's green, it's on. Good evening. All right, we'll go ahead and make ourselves comfortable. And of course, we are over the next several months having several of our men share with us from the Psalms. And this is it's good for the whole body. It's good for the individual that shares, but it's also good for us to hear some different perspectives from within the body. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from Brother David Watson tonight. And then you got me again next week, but then after that, we'll go on a few-week run of some of these other men. So, Brother David, you come ahead and share with us. I told him to try to keep it under an hour and a half, so maybe it'll go smoothly for us. All right, brother. God bless you, man.
Good evening. We're in Psalm 54. If you would join me for the reading. This is an answered prayer for deliverance from adversities to the chief musicians with stringed instruments. And it's noted here that it's a very specific request for the stringed instruments, because usually it's just saying for musicians, but this is for stringed instruments. A contemplation of David when the Zephonites want to say, is David hiding among us? Save me, O God, by your name, and vindicate me by your strength. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to my words, to the words of my mouth, for strangers have risen against me, and oppressors have sought after my life. They have not set God before them. Selah. Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is with those who uphold my life. He will repay my enemies for their evil, cut them off in your truth. I freely sacrifice to you. I will praise your name, O Lord, for it is good. For he has delivered me out of all trouble, and my eyes have seen its desire upon my enemies. Now, this is a Miskil Psalms, which means that it is a teaching psalm, that we are to learn something from this psalm. It has insight into how we are to be, and that we should learn from this psalm what it is to be faithful to God and what it is not to be faithful to God. The psalm is set in 1 Samuel 23:9, where it says, Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, Is David not among us in the strongholds of the woods and in the hills of whatever, which is on the south of Jeshurun? Here, they were trying to curry favor with King Saul by telling him where David was hiding. Also, by them trying to curry favor with Saul, they made themselves enemies towards God. And just like when we try to curry favor with the world, we make ourselves enemies with God. David was on the run from King Saul when those that should have helped David turned their backs on him, seeking to harm David. The Ziphites were from the Jude of Judah, same as what David was, so they were kindred to David, and they should have been willing to have helped him, which may have been part of the reason why he was hiding there. Now, looking at the psalm, it is divided into 3 sections. The first section is David praying to God for help from those trying to harm him. Second, David is expressing his confidence as God as his helper that he will preserve his life. He is trusting that God will deal with those who hurt him. And third, David is praising God for what he knows that God will do, even if it hasn't happened at that moment. That David has the faith to believe that it already has happened. And just as David was in trouble and called out for God to deliver him, so we are able to call out to God for his help. David could see that only God could help him, and that David so believed it that he was able to express that to God. And David also expressed what was going on. For strangers him and sought his life. David called them strangers even though they were related to him because they were treating him as a stranger. And by the fact that the Ziphonites were treating David as a stranger, God treated them as strangers. And David recognized that in the situation that he was in, that he could not take care of it on his own. When we face opposition, do we call on God by name, telling him what's going on in our lives, then honestly and humbly trusting that God will handle the situation without our help? And are we believing that God can and will help us? Now, in verse 4, David proclaimed, God is my helper. The Lord will uphold those who, God will help those who uphold my life. David knew where his help would come from. And just like Abraham was credited for righteousness for believing God, so David believed God the same. And David also believed God would deal with those that were trying to harm him and kill him. David also believed that God would deal with those and with himself. Do we let God handle those who are trying to hurt us? Do we trust God to take care of those that are coming against us according to his truth? Not our truth, but his truth. Then do we give thanks even before we have the help that we need? Are we sure that God will and can? And are we being an aid to those who are in need, just like the Ziphonites could have done and would have been blessed? Are we allowing God to bless us by helping those that are in need? This psalm was inspired by the people of Ziphill for their betrayal of David. Saul had been rejected by God and in jealousy wanted to kill David. While David was in the region of the Ziphs, he should have been safe among the fellow Judites. The people instead went to Saul to tell them where David was hiding, not just once, but twice. That David faced the same thing from the people. David begins praying to the Lord for rescue. He describes who they are and what they're trying to do. And he asked God for vindication. The vindication that he was looking for was to be proven that he was right and that the people were wrong. And the proof would come by God answering his prayer. How about us? Do we trust that God will show us right in his time? Or do we try and do it in our time? After asking God to rescue him, David expresses supreme confidence that God will keep him alive, that he will be spared, even going through the difficult time. Rather than seeking revenge himself, David puts the getting even in God's hands. For God is a righteous judge. He will judge because he is right. And because of God's prior protection of David, he was fully confident that God would save him now. How about us? Do we trust that God has saved us yesterday? He will save us tomorrow. Even if we're going through a fire today. We have seen how David handled those who were seeking to do him wrong by first realizing they were trying to do him wrong and realizing who was able to handle it. Do we do that? Do we turn it over to God, or are we tempted to try and handle things ourselves? And usually get in God's way, then God has to deal with us to get us out of the way so that God can deal with those that need to be dealt with. God is able to handle whatever comes our way if we let him. And if we seek to give it to God first rather than as a last resort. Just like I heard someone say, well, I've done everything else, I guess it's time to pray. And are we trusting God enough to acknowledge he can handle whatever we're going through? He is God, but he is also a personal God. And again, David could have tried to handle the situation for himself, and I believe it would have gone very bad for him if he had. Just like so many times when we try and take charge, we try and do hands-on, and then we have to back up to where we left God at and start all over. The same way when we try to take God's place, when we try to handle what's going on around us without his help. David could have done that, gone in, slaughtered the people, and then they wouldn't have been able to talk to Saul. But the consequences of doing that, the consequences of those actions would have been very grave. And then, in the middle of our trials, do we seek to give God praise? Do we seek to take the time just to thank Him even for the trial if we don't see it or understand why? Now, I'm going to go back just to a little verse by verse study because that's what I did here. Now, in verse 1 it says, "Save me, O God, by your name. For it is by the name of the Lord that we are saved, and that there is no other name to be saved by, and that by His strength we are made right." Because we have no right standing with God on our own. And there's nothing that we can offer God on our own that is worthy of God. And now a quote that I came across that I thought was good. "By God's name, there is nothing less than the fullness of God that is enough for the necessities of man." The next part of that verse says, "Vindicate me by your strength." David's rescue was his vindication. For the people that were going after him would have had no greater evidence that David was right than God protecting and saving him. In verse 2, David is seeking to say, "Hear my prayer, O God." David is asking that God would hear his plea, and David is also asking that God would not hear the words of those trying to harm him. David is asking God to hear his prayers, humbly himself, then coming to God to make the request that God would give ears to his words, that the Lord would hear and act on his behalf, that God would incline himself towards David, just like we need God to be inclined towards us. The way we get God inclined towards us by coming to him humbly and with faith. Then in verse 3, it goes on talking, what are others trying to do to him? That they have risen up against him and have tried to seek his life, and that they have not put God before them. There is no fear of the Lord. They don't have that right relationship before God. For one, they're turning in one of their own family members, and they wouldn't have already heard and known who David was. So they're acting twice wrongly. And they were in disobedience towards God and towards David. For they did not have the fear of the Lord in their hearts or lives. And the rejection of David was demonstrating just how far from God that they were. Now, in verse 4, David recognizes that God is his only hope. God's his only chance of living. Just like God's our only chance to live in this life and the one to come. Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is with those who uphold my life. The Lord, the Lord is the one that held his, and the Lord is the one that upholds him. And that the Lord will preserve David just as it is with us. The Lord is the one who holds us in all things. When people rail against us, God is there if we let him be there. Now, we can keep him from helping us. We can block God from saving us. And whose fault is that? If we seek to do what is right, we can trust God to hold us. Now, on in verse 5, David asked that God will repay his enemies for their evils, and that God would cut them off according to his truth. Now, to cut them off, from what I have read, meaning, you don't just kill them, you kill all of their family, all of their relatives. So that's a lot of people to be dealt with. But God, being a righteous judge, he can and can save. David is seeking that God will repay the evil according to the truth and his will. He is the righteous judge. He is the one that sees all that happens, even when we see so little. God is showing that David is showing that he knows he's not the one to pay back, just as we're not the ones to pay back for those that seek to do us harm. Do we trust God? Really trust God to make things right? As they say, to balance the scales. That it is the Lord's place to pay back. It's not our place to pay back. For when we do, we then become enemies towards God. In verse 6, we see David praising God and offering sacrifices to God. That he has not been delivered yet, but he believes and knows that he will. How about us? Do we, when we're in the middle of the storm, are we still trying in a storm? And knowing that God is in charge, that God is good, even in the middle of the hard times. In verse 7, David is praising God for what he is going to do. David is rejoicing for a complete deliverance. He praises the name of the Lord, for his name is good. And it is by the Lord that David got delivered. David is also asking God that he will repay those who have done him wrong, and that his eyes might see them repaid within his lifetime. And not asking for it right then and there, but in God's time, when God's ready to repay. That's not always easy for us. It's not always easy for me, because I just soon hit them first before they hit me. Do we let God be God? And do we come before him at his feet, giving all to him?
That's how you do that. Very good. A lot of challenge questions in there, and I'm thankful for that. And unbeknownst to a lot of the church, we're walking a path very much like that psalm right now. Between us and this contractor out here, and all of this will come out in the near future. But we are absolutely, I would love to turn you loose on him, Brother David. And I'd probably hold him down while you stomped on him, but I hope we're off air by now. But anyway,